On the morning of Saturday, November 18th, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller reached down and grabbed the pull cord that was connected to the outboard motor that was on the boat that Michael was riding in. And Michael, he pulled and pulled on that cord, but he could not get this engine to restart. It just sputtered and wouldn't turn over. And without power, that meant that Michael and his small crew just continued to drift farther and farther out to sea. But that wasn't even the worst of this situation. The boat that Michael and his crew were on, which was a 40-foot long catamaran, it was two handcrafted canoes tied together, well, it was starting to sink. Minutes before, Michael and his crew had been happily traveling along the beautiful green jungled coast of New Guinea when they had to cross over this area where the water was particularly turbulent. There was this river in New Guinea that was feeding out to the Arafura Sea, which is where Michael and his crew were, and where this brown river met the blue water, it became very choppy with lots of rough waves. And so as Michael and his crew tried to cross that area, the waves came on board, they flooded the engine, it shut off, and then as more and more waves landed inside the boat began to sink. The reason why Michael and his crew were even out here and taking these chances to begin with is because Michael wanted to go see this tribe called the Asmats that lived in New Guinea, basically right past this area where this river was. They lived right on the coast. Michael was obsessed with the artwork that the Asmat tribe created, in particular, the very unique bis pole. These poles are created by the master carvers within the Asmat tribe. What they do is they take a single piece of wood and they etch it away until it looks like it's a bunch of men standing on each other's shoulders. Now, these bis poles are totally beautiful and intricate and wonderful to look at, but the Asmat tribe doesn't make them for art. They make them because they believe they contain the souls of the warriors from their tribe who have been killed in combat. And until the Asmats avenge these downed warriors, basically until the tribe kills their enemies, these souls remain trapped in these bis poles, which means the Asmats don't really ever get rid of these poles. They don't sell them. They don't throw them away. They are just part of their culture and society. But months ago, Michael had come and visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned about these bis poles and what they meant, and he believed he had successfully negotiated a deal where he would barter some of his own goods in order to get one of their bis poles. But even though Michael gave them all the things he had offered, they had not in return sent the bis pole. And so now Michael was coming back to hopefully be able to claim the bis pole and take it with him. But as Michael sat in his sinking catamaran, watching the muddy shores of New Guinea get farther and farther away as he drifted farther and farther out into the Arafura Sea, the last thing on his mind was the bis pole. He needed to figure out what they were going to do. Michael's crew consisted of 3 other people. There was a French anthropologist named René, and there were 2 teenagers who were actually Asmat guides, and their names were Simon and Leo. And so after Michael was unable to start the engine up, all 3 of them took their turn yanking on the cord, but they too could not get it to start. Finally, Simon and Leo spoke up, and they said to Michael and René that at this point they believed their only hope was abandoning the catamaran, jumping into the ocean, and swimming to shore, which for now was about a half-mile away, but they were drifting so quickly out to sea that if they waited any longer, they might be too far away to actually make that swim. But René was not a good swimmer at all, and Michael was just not ready to totally abandon ship and leave this thing out here to sink, because on board the catamaran was all this stuff he had brought along, like tobacco and fishing line and clothes and candy and all this different stuff that he knew this tribe wouldn't have, and he could use it as leverage to continue bartering to get his bis pole and to get other artwork they might be offering. And so even though Michael understood that obviously this catamaran and everything on it is going to sink into the ocean at some point, he just wasn't there mentally to jump off now and just kind of abandon all this stuff. And so a decision was made that the 2 Asmat guides, the 2 teenagers, Simon and Leo, they on their own would jump out, swim to shore, and try to get help, while Michael and René stayed back and waited for that help to come. And so a few moments later, the 2 teenagers jumped into the water and began their long swim to shore. And as they did, Michael watched, and it suddenly dawned on him just how far away he was from his own home. It had been months since Michael had last showered, so he smelled terrible. He was totally sunburned and caked in dirt, and his hands were rough and calloused from all the rowing he was doing. But this was not really Michael's real life, because Michael was not from New Guinea or from anywhere near here. He was actually from America, where his family was one of the most well-known, influential, and richest families ever. Like in the history of humanity, the Rockefeller family are in like the top 10 of the most powerful people ever. Michael's grandfather was the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, who at the time was literally the richest man in the world, and Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was at the time the governor of New York and the future vice president of the United States. But despite having these unbelievable resources at his disposal, Michael was not compelled to kind of be a Rockefeller. Instead, he found his calling in the wilds of New Guinea. He had first come here 7 months earlier with a team of Harvard University filmmakers who were looking to document a very remote tribe. And Michael just fell in love with the adventure of this trip, even though on this trip, while they were filming a battle between this remote tribe and another tribe, Michael got shot accidentally in the shoulder with an arrow. So despite being wounded effectively in combat, Michael just loved being in New Guinea. In fact, Michael actually never told his family about getting shot in the shoulder with this arrow because he was worried if he told his family, the all-powerful Rockefeller family, they would respond by seeking out retribution against one of these tribes that had inadvertently harmed Michael Rockefeller. And so Michael was just very respectful and protective of the people he came in contact with in New Guinea, and in many ways he viewed them as more like his people than his family. And so after the Harvard University filmmakers wrapped up their documentary and went back to America, Michael had stayed in New Guinea. And in the meantime, his father, Nelson Rockefeller, had opened up a museum back home in New York called the Museum of Primitive Art, and what it displayed was artwork from places like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and so many Westerners viewed natives of New Guinea, like the people of the Asmat tribe, as being very primitive and backwards. And so as a result, there was a lot of people that were drawn to this new museum in New York just for the spectacle of it, to see what these primitive backwards people were creating. But Michael felt like he had a deeper understanding of the natives of New Guinea, and he felt like it was his responsibility to go out and find the incredible artwork all around New Guinea, including like the Bispoles from the Asmat tribe, and send that artwork back to his father to be put up in this museum so that it was more than just a spectacle. Michael wanted the people of the West to appreciate and respect the natives of New Guinea the same way he did, and he believed through art he could do that. And so Michael had teamed up with René, the French anthropologist, to go all around New Guinea to find this artwork to send back to his dad. A few hours after Simon and Leo had leapt off the sinking catamaran and began their swim to shore, Michael and René had no idea if they'd even made it to shore. They hadn't seen anybody show up to rescue them, and so as far as they knew, they had no idea how close they were to being rescued or not. And as they looked down, they saw their catamaran was sinking lower and lower in the water. And so at some point, Michael and René just grabbed buckets and began bailing the water out of the catamaran, which was totally useless. The water was coming in way too quickly, but they had nothing else to do, and so they're bailing the water out, and then a rogue wave comes through and flips the entire catamaran over, sending Michael and René into the sea. And so luckily, Michael and René were able to swim to the surface. They swam over to the now upturned catamaran, but there was an air pocket kind of trapped underneath it, and so it was staying afloat. And so Michael and René grabbed onto the catamaran, and Michael actually grabbed a gas canister that had come off the boat, and he attached it to his belt like a flotation device. And so he and René just kind of held on to this upturned catamaran. Michael was also supported by this gas canister, and they just continued to wait, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it to shore and that help would be arriving soon. But in the back of Michael's mind, he knew that if help didn't come soon, Michael might have to do something drastic, like attempt the swim himself, which now was way farther than half a mile away. By the next morning, when the sun came up, Michael and René were still in the water, holding onto that catamaran, waiting for help to arrive, but no help had come. Now, Michael was a very good swimmer, but by this point, he knew they were at least 5 or maybe even 10 miles from shore. So this would be a gargantuan swim in pretty rough waters. But, Michael, he's a Rockefeller. He had a lot of confidence, and he began telling Renee that, hey, I'm going to do this swim. I know I can do it. I can swim the whole distance. Even if it's 10 miles, I can do it. You're going to have to just hang tight. It's going to take a while, but I'll get us help. Renee begged Michael not to go, but Michael said, I have to do something, otherwise we're gonna die out here. And so all Renee could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes and attached another gas canister to his belt to give him a little bit more flotation. And then Michael shook Renee's hand. And then right around 8 a.m. on Sunday, November 19th, 1961, Michael began the swim. About 12 hours later, so that night, while Renee is still just holding onto this catamaran, hoping help is going to come soon, suddenly, kind of without warning, the sky suddenly erupted with this incredibly bright flame. And what it was a plane flying overhead that had spotted Renee and the upturned catamaran. They had fired a flare into the air to be like, hey, we see you, we're going to send help. And then just a couple of hours later, a boat came around and picked Renee up. And when Renee climbed on board, he was so relieved, and he asked the captain, hey, did Michael Rockefeller tell you I was out here? Is that why you knew I was here? And the captain said, no, we were told by 2 teenagers, 2 guides, Simon and Leo, that you were out here. No one's heard from Michael. Now, you need to remember that Michael Rockefeller was a Rockefeller. And so as soon as Renee heard, oh my goodness, we don't know where Michael is, and he told the captain that Michael had begun this unbelievably long swim to shore to get help, it was like suddenly a bomb had gone off in the Rockefeller family, and they committed all of their money and their resources and their influence to launch the biggest manhunt basically ever to find Michael. They dispatched ships and helicopters and planes. They got in touch with the US Navy and got them to be fully involved. I mean, they looked everywhere for weeks, but they could not find Michael. This search for Michael would continue for years. Now, it wouldn't be as intense as the first few weeks, but there was always somebody or some entity looking for Michael around the area where he had begun that swim. But by 1964, so 3 years after Michael had begun the swim to shore, the Rockefeller family finally accepted that Michael had to be dead, that he had to have drowned on that 5 or 10 mile swim to shore. And when the family finally kind of accepted that that is what happened, that became the story in America about what happened to Michael Rockefeller. In fact, his sister even wrote a best-selling book about grieving his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread about what happened to Michael. Rumors about his fate were whispered along trade routes and between visiting missionaries and gossiped about in tabloid and adventure magazines. In 1969, so 5 years after Michael was declared dead by his family, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard from this mysterious Australian person who was a source for this magazine that they had actually run into Michael Rockefeller recently in the jungle of New Guinea, not far from where he supposedly disappeared. And Milt would actually follow up on this tip, despite how not credible it was, and he would go to New Guinea with a film crew, and he would go to this area, and he would look everywhere for Michael. He would talk to locals. I mean, he really scoured the area, but there was no sign of Michael. And so Milt, feeling very let down by this, he came back home, and he actually wrote a best-selling book about his quest to find Michael Rockefeller. But crucially, even though he had shot all this footage, both at a distance and up close, of all these tribes in the area where Michael supposedly was, he and his team never really reviewed the footage. They basically shot all this footage while they were there looking for Michael, couldn't find him, and said, meh, and put the footage aside. But 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to go to New Guinea and look for Michael, because there were still all these rumors floating around that Michael was alive and living in the jungles of New Guinea. And before they actually went to New Guinea to go looking for Michael, they uncovered this unwatched footage from Milt Macklin, and they watched all of it, and they discovered something unbelievable. Amongst the hours and hours of footage, there is this brief shot taken from a distance where the film crew was shooting on land out towards the water, and you see this canoe come into frame. And it's full of Asmat tribe warriors. This is a war party, and they're making their way, presumably, into battle with some other tribe. But amongst these big, strong men is one man who totally stands out because he doesn't look like the other Asmat warriors. He is a naked, bearded white man who, again, even though the quality of the film was poor, he totally looked like Michael Rockefeller. And so as soon as word got out about this footage, very quickly rumors began to spread all around the world about how this heir to a billionaire's fortune had decided to turn away from his family and just live amongst the Asmat tribe as one of theirs. Now, again, we have no idea if that really was Michael Rockefeller. It could easily have been, a missionary or some other white person that happened to be in New Guinea, but the story was incredible, and so it spread everywhere. In 2012, so 4 years after this unwatched Milt Macklin footage came to light, and over 50 years since Michael Rockefeller actually went missing, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman, who had grown up totally fascinated by the mystery surrounding Michael Rockefeller, he decided that he would go to New Guinea and finally get to the bottom of what happened to Michael Rockefeller. And after Carl and his interpreter went to New Guinea and lived with the Asmat tribe for months and gained their trust and gained their respect, they began to tell him a brand new story that he had never heard before about what happened to Michael. The real story. And they gave him a dire warning that if he ever told anyone what actually happened to Michael, that the whole village would likely be killed, and maybe even he too would be killed. But Carl didn't listen. After hearing what really happened to Michael, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And from his book, here is what happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of November 19th, 1961, so roughly 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the water and began this 5 to 10 mile swim to shore to get help, 3 Asmat tribe elders named Finn, Ajim, and Pep sat amongst 50 other tribe members in 8 long canoes. And they weren't going anywhere. They were just kind of resting at the mouth of this river, the same river that dumped out into the Arafura Sea, which is exactly where Michael and his crew had ran into all those rough waters and overturned, causing their whole situation. And so all these tribes people are just sitting there in their canoes. Some of them are smoking loosely wrapped cigars. Others are chewing on flour made from a palm plant called sago. And they're all naked, minus a couple of bands around their knees and their elbows, and some of them had very intricate piercings in their noses and their ears, but they're all just kind of sitting there. It was a long day, and they're enjoying some peace and quiet. But then suddenly, Ajim, one of the elders, noticed something making its way into the river from the sea. It was this white thing kind of slithering towards them, and immediately Ajim called out to the others to look, there's something over there. It's a white crocodile, it's a serpent, it's something. And they all look, and they're watching, and slowly this white thing is moving its way closer and closer to them. And so, not wanting to be caught off guard, the entire group got ready and began paddling over to see what this thing was, because if it was a threat, they could deal with it. If it wasn't, so be it. And so as these 8 canoes converged on this white thing, some of them had their spears up ready to attack. But when they finally saw what this creature was, they realized it was not some serpent or crocodile or something. It was a white man, and he was floating on his back, and he had these weird flotation devices on, but he was not a threat. And so right away, all the tribesmen, they put down their spears, they kind of laugh, thinking that they were in danger for a second. And this white man, who was Michael Rockefeller, he rolled over and he looked up and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He's just swam like 10 miles to get here, and he's seeing the tribe that he had come to see in the first place. They've come here to rescue him. And so practically crying with relief, he turned around and grabbed one of their canoes. And as soon as he did, one of the elders, Pep, looked down at Michael holding onto his boat, and then Pep looked up at the other 2 elders, Finn and Ajim, and they just stared at each other, then back at Michael, then back at each other, and then they nodded in agreement. And then Pep helped Michael into the boat. Michael immediately just laid in the middle of the boat. He was so exhausted from that swim, but he was so relieved, and he just laid there while the tribe kind of got back into position. They turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river, back inland. And as they paddled, they began this very strange chant. All 8 canoes, all 50 plus members of the tribe, all in unison began this chant. And Michael, he had studied the Asmat tribe and felt like he knew a lot about their culture, but he had never heard this particular chant before. And so he was enchanted by it, and he tried to ask them, what does this mean? But they just completely ignored Michael and just continued to paddle and chant. And so Michael just laid there listening, getting carried along to safety, when all of a sudden the chanting stopped and the canoes turned and kind of made their way into this little inlet that led to a clearing right on the shore. And so Michael noticed they were slowing down, and so he kind of barely got up and looked over the edge of the canoe to see if they were at their village. But when he looked up, he saw there was no village in sight. It was just this clearing out on the shore. And right away, Michael's like, well, I hope we're going to the village soon, because I have to find someone who can get in touch with the authorities, who can then go and rescue Renee and hopefully find Simon and Leo as well. And so Michael began trying to ask the men in his canoe if they would help him, but there was, of course, a massive language barrier, and neither side really understood the other. And then at some point, one of the men from the Asmat tribe just began laughing at Michael. And when he did, the majority of the rest of the tribe looked over, saw what was going on, and they too began laughing at Michael. And so Michael had no idea what was going on. And then before he could do anything else, the entire tribe stopped laughing, and it was like in an instant, they were back into that rhythmic chanting as they slowly began making their way out of their canoes, making their way onto shore. And so Michael began to sense that something was wrong, and instead of getting out of the canoe with the rest of the tribe, he kind of instinctively laid back down on the canoe, almost like he was trying to get away from them. And when he did that, the tribesman who had first laughed at Michael, he stood right over Michael as he's doing this chant, and he smiled at Michael, and then he raised his spear and he drove it into Michael's side. And the second he did that, other members of the tribe raised these horns they were carrying and began blasting into their horns. And so Michael, he's screaming out in pain, but he's got no strength to defend himself. And so he kind of like rolled over onto the other side on this canoe, kind of trying to protect himself. And when he did that, the guy just lifted his spear again with a big smile on his face and drove it into Michael's other side. After the man pulled the spear out, Michael, who's in horrible pain, managed, perhaps with his adrenaline, to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. So he kind of fell out onto the mud, and he tried to stand up to get away from them, but there was nowhere he could go. And so as he's kind of fumbling in the mud, 2 of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under the arms, and they began carrying him across the clearing towards the jungle. And as they walked, that rhythmic chanting continued, and periodically Michael would hear someone blast on their horn. And so Michael was dragged across the shoreline into the jungle, and then finally to another clearing in the jungle, not anywhere near their village. And Michael was positioned in the middle of this clearing and put on his knees. And so Michael, he's kind of guarding his sides with his arms. He's incredibly weak. He's on his knees. The tribe kind of formed a circle around him, and they're continuing this chant. And then at some point, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. And then another tribe member walked in. And again, the whole time, this chanting is going on, horns are being blown, and this other tribesman comes up and he raises an axe and he brings it down on the back of Michael's neck. It would turn out the Asmat tribe knew who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit several months earlier when he had attempted to barter for their bis poles. And they had been totally offended that this rich white man had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their sacred artifacts like it was some trinket to be put on display in a museum. And so they had held on to a deep hatred for him. That was why they didn't send their bis pole to him. They weren't going to give it to him. But when Michael had kind of magically floated into their river, and suddenly the Asmat tribe has him sitting in their canoe, the 3 village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, they all just kind of looked at each other and nodded in agreement that they were going to ritualistically kill Michael to avenge the deaths of many of their fallen warriors that those bis poles apparently contained the souls of, because many of their warriors had been killed by white men in the past, and so Michael was going to be their way to avenge their souls. And so that chant that Michael heard them all saying, that was the chant they did when they performed this execution ritual. Except they didn't just kill Michael. After one of those tribesmen brought the axe down on the back of Michael's neck, another tribesman walked up and grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and used a knife to slash at his throat to actually remove his head. And then after his head was removed, again with all the chanting continuing in this circle the whole time, members of the tribe came up and began cutting Michael's body absolutely to pieces, separating his organs and his flesh and his bones into different piles, and then very quickly they got a fire going and cooked and ate Michael. And of all the parts of his body that were eaten, his brain was apparently the most important, and so only Finn, Ajim, and Pep, the three elders, were allowed to eat the brain. And then finally, after they had finished eating and took all the remaining meat that had not been consumed, and they put it into their pouches to eat later, Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull, and he would bring it back to the village, and he would cover it in banana leaves, and he would paint it, and treat it like a trophy. A few days later, when that huge search party came through the area looking for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew they could never whisper a word about what happened to Michael, because if it got out, it's very likely that Westerners would want to retaliate against them. And so for decades and decades, their secret stayed safe until Carl Hoffman of the National Geographic heard the story and then wrote the book about it, Savage Harvest. But despite publishing this book and lots of people reading it, there was always some question about the credibility of the story, because remember, there's all this intrigue and mystery around Michael's story to begin with, and now we have this account coming from the Asmat tribe, and so no one really knew how legitimate it was. And so to this day, the Rockefeller family, and generally speaking, authorities at large, still say that Michael Rockefeller drowned on his swim to shore trying to get help, and that's it. On the night of February 12th, 2017, a young woman named Sidi Aisha saw something coming over to her that surprised her so much that she gasped and she put her drink down on the bar. The bar she was at was called the Hard Rock Cafe in Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital city of Malaysia. This night for Sidi had already been one of the best in recent memory, but now it was getting even better because a waitress was walking over to her carrying a birthday cake with a candle lit in the middle, and Sidi knew it was for her. So she stepped forward kind of bashfully, and all of Sidi's friends who were there with her kind of formed up around her, and as the waitress came over to Sidi, the friends all immediately began singing happy birthday to Sidi. It was Sidi's 25th birthday, and she could not believe how far she had come. Here she was in this beautiful American-styled restaurant, surrounded by her friends, who were these big TV show producers, and tonight they were throwing a party for her, something that did not happen often in Sidi's life to this point. After Sidi's friends finished singing happy birthday, Sidi leaned forward and she blew out her candle, but she didn't even make a wish before she blew it out, because to her, she felt like she had everything she had ever wanted. And so instead, as she blew that candle out, she just made a point to feel incredibly grateful for the life that she now had. Because not long ago, Sidi's life looked very different. Sidi had grown up in a tiny town inside of a jungle in Indonesia. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her parents were very poor farmers that barely made enough money to provide shelter and food for their kids. In fact, Sidi's parents were so poor that they couldn't afford to send her to high school. They needed her to stay home and go to work to help support the family. Sidi would end up getting married, and she would have a son with her husband, but her husband would divorce her and not provide any support for their kid. And so suddenly Sidi was the single mother trying to look out for her son while also trying to provide for her parents and her other siblings. And eventually it became so difficult to find enough work to provide for all these people that Sidi was forced to go abroad and look for work elsewhere outside of Indonesia, which meant she had to leave behind not only her parents and siblings, but also her son. Her son had to stay with her parents. Sidi would ultimately find work as a masseuse in a hotel in Malaysia called the Flamingo. Now, Sidi really did not like this work at all, but it paid well enough and she needed the money badly enough that she decided to just keep on doing it. Sometimes Sidi, like a lot of the other girls that she worked with at the hotel, would daydream about being discovered as a model or a singer or an actress and getting taken away from this life to a life of luxury and wealth and leisure. But Sidi never really expected that to happen. Next to Sidi at the bar was her producer, whose name was James. and James had his arm around her, and he suddenly flashed her his cell phone, and he kind of pointed to the screen. And City looked at it, and she saw there was a text message from someone, but it was in a language that she didn't recognize. And she asked James, what is that? And James grinned at her and said, "This is my boss telling me that you are already a superstar in Korea." And when City heard this, she was totally embarrassed, but also really excited. City had met James about a month ago in January of 2017, when City and some of her friends from the hotel had decided to go out for the night. Now, City very rarely went out. She basically worked and slept and then sent home her money to her family. But for whatever reason, she had been convinced by her friends to go out and have a good time. And so she was all dolled up, and she and her friends were standing in line to get into a bar when a very handsome man wearing a suit, James, walked up to City and said, "Have you done any acting?" And City, wearing her best clothes with her friends, she suddenly felt bold, and she told this guy, who she didn't know, that, "No, I haven't, but I'd like to try." And so James asked her if she'd come with him, and she said okay. And they went to this cafe, and they sat down, got coffees, and James explained to City who he was. And he told her he was a Japanese television producer who specialized in hidden camera prank videos. And he needed actresses to put on pretty clothes and pull pranks on unsuspecting people on camera. City had initially been very skeptical of James and this proposition, but at the same time, back then, prank videos were all the rage on YouTube, they were on mainstream TV, they were everywhere, and City knew that, but she had never thought about being in one. She just sometimes liked to watch them. But James would tell her, "This is really easy work, and you'll get paid well for it." And so City had ultimately said, "Okay, yeah, I'll do it with you." And after she said yes, her life had been a whirlwind. No longer was she a masseuse at a hotel, but instead, she was like a celebrity, flying all over the country, filming all these prank videos, and James's bosses were so pumped, they kept messaging him, telling him how amazing she was, and how every video she was doing was outperforming anything they hoped it could do. I mean, everything was going perfectly. City took a few more bites of her birthday cake, and then she checked her watch and saw it was almost 10 p.m., which for James and her other friends might be early, but for City, that was pretty late. Plus, she had already had a lot of alcohol that night, and so that was making her more tired. And so she told James and the others she was going to leave, she thanked them for the party, and then she headed out and went to her hotel. As soon as City was in her room, she immediately called her mother. City and her mom talked all the time, sometimes multiple times a day, and this night, City just really missed her mom, and she really missed her son. And as soon as she called her mom picked up, and they chatted for a bit, and City told her all about how she'd had this amazing birthday party, and how excited she was about the next day, because they were shooting a really big prank. It was going to be their biggest one yet, and it would have the biggest payout of any of the videos she had done so far. This one, tomorrow, was going to pay her $100 US. And City told her mom, "Don't worry, I'm sending all of it back home to you all." City's mother was so thankful and so excited for her daughter, and she said, "That's wonderful, get a good night's sleep, and I'll be thinking of you tomorrow." And after that, City talked to her son for a couple of seconds, and then they hung up, and City crawled into bed, she turned off the light, and she tried to sleep, but she couldn't. She was too excited about tomorrow's shoot. She and James had been talking about this particular prank for the last week, and they'd been rehearsing it over and over again, and now here she was on the precipice of actually doing it in real life. The pranks that City did were all pretty similar and pretty simple. She and James would go to some train station or some hotel or some other public area, and they would identify an unsuspecting older man, and then City, all dressed up, would go up to this guy while she was being filmed at a distance, and she would either kiss the man on the cheek or spray him with perfume or rub chili oil on his hand, and then she would giggle and run away, and then the camera crew would zoom in on the man's face as he's kind of bewildered and trying to figure out why that had just happened. But tomorrow's prank, even though it was pretty similar to the ones she had done, it would be the first time she'd be working with another actor. In fact, two other actors. One of the actors was a woman who would be doing the pranking with City, and then their target, the unsuspecting man, was also an actor. James and the Japanese television production company had insisted that for this prank to work, this guy really did need to be in on it. City had already met and rehearsed a couple of times with the other woman who she'd be doing this prank with, but she had not met the third actor, the unsuspecting man, yet. She'd be meeting him the next day, actually during the prank. City would eventually fall asleep that night, and then her alarm would go off fairly early the next morning, and when it did, City immediately got out of bed and she got dressed in a dark form-fitting outfit. She put on some red lipstick, and then she hustled out of her room, downstairs, and out of the hotel to meet James, the woman actress she'd be working with that day, and the other producers who were involved in the production. Then, as a big group, they hopped in a cab and went to the international airport where this big prank was going to take place. And when they got there, they made their way to a restaurant in the departures area to wait for the third actor, the unsuspecting man, to show up so they could begin the shoot. And while they waited, City and the other actress she'd be working with struck up a conversation. The other actress's name was Duan Thi Huang, and she was a 28-year-old woman from Vietnam. And just like City, she had come from a poor family and she had gone abroad to find work to help support her family, and it was during this time that she was abroad that she was recruited to star in these prank videos. But unlike City, who daydreamed about maybe being a singer or a model or an actress or something someday, for Doan, acting was the only thing she ever thought of. Her whole life, the only thing she ever wanted was to be an actress. In fact, Doan had left school to pursue a career in show business. She had been on a show called Vietnam Idol, but unfortunately did not make it past the first round. And she had actually done a few other prank videos with a different production company, but neither of those two ventures had ever really panned out. It wasn't until she was recruited by James and his team to be a part of these videos that Doan finally felt like she was on the right track. And as they talked, City couldn't help but feel like Doan was just a little bit weird. She did like Doan, she had no issues with her, but Doan had chose to wear, for this big shoot today, a very childish outfit. Instead of wearing something similar to what City had on, which City imagined she would be, Doan was wearing this weird childish looking t-shirt that just said LOL on it, and she was carrying around with her everywhere this huge oversized teddy bear. But City just chalked it up to, maybe James and the other producers told Doan to dress this way, and that's why. The group took their time at breakfast inside of this restaurant, just waiting for this third actor to show up. And finally, at 9 a.m., so after an hour of just sitting there, one of the producers actually said, "Hey, there he is right there." And so City and Doan and James, they looked out into the very crowded area, and sure enough, where the producer was pointing was this guy who looked exactly like all of their other victims. He was this middle-aged, stocky guy carrying a briefcase who totally blended in with the hundreds of other people out there. And the producers told City and Doan that it looked like this actor had already begun the scene. He was already heading over to the self-check-in kiosk, which was like the start of this prank. And so they told City and Doan, like, go, start the prank. And so City grabbed the perfume that she was given to spray in this guy's face, and the producers rushed to rub this oil on Doan's hands, along with give her a wet cloth, because that was what she was going to need for her side of this prank. And then City and Doan stood up and began making their way out into the very crowded terminal. And as she walked, City couldn't help but feel very nervous, because she knew this was her big chance to show James and the other producers that she could work well with other actors, and that she could do a fairly complex prank. City and Doan made their way right behind the third actor, and as he continued to punch the screen of the self-serve kiosk, the two women split up, just like they had rehearsed. City walked around the man and got on the backside of this kiosk, basically looking at the man who was looking down at the computer screen, and Doan stayed where she was. And then Doan looked up at City and nodded, which was the signal, at which point City rushed forward right in front of this guy, who looked up and acted surprised, and then Doan ran up behind him and grabbed his face and rubbed her hands and that wet cloth all over his face, and then City, as soon as that was happening, sprayed the perfume on the guy's face as well, and then the two women kind of giggled and said sorry, and then walked away in separate directions. As City walked to the bathroom to wash the perfume off her hands, she was very conscious of the fact that she was still very likely being filmed, and so she checked her hair a couple of times and made sure her clothes were just right, and then she disappeared into the bathroom, she washed her hands, and then she looked up at the mirror and she smiled, because she knew she had nailed this prank and she was going to be a star. After City had finished washing up, she left the bathroom and made her way over to the meetup point, kind of on the other side of the airport where Doan, James, and the other producers were going to meet up, but no one was there. And she thought that was weird because they had totally planned to meet at this point after the prank. But after a little while, City told herself that, maybe they had already headed down to the taxi waiting area, and that's where they are, and they're waiting for me. So City left the airport and went to the taxi waiting area, but when she got there, she found herself alone again. And so City would stand there looking around, waiting for about 15 minutes, and when still she didn't see anybody, she texted James and said, where are you? But she didn't get a response. And so feeling kind of annoyed, City finally just flagged down a taxi on her own, hopped in, and told the driver she just wanted to go back to her hotel. And then on the drive to the hotel, City started to get car sick and kind of nauseous, and she figured it didn't help that she had drank a bunch the night before, so she was still a little bit hungover. And at some point, she actually had to tell the driver to pull over so she could vomit outside. And so finally, when City got back to her hotel and got back to her room, she felt so crappy and she was so upset with how everything was going that she didn't even bother to get undressed. She just jumped into her bed and fell asleep. City would sleep for several hours, and when she woke up again, she still felt totally hungover and gross, and she rolled over and checked her phone, expecting to see a message from James explaining why they had ditched her after the prank, but there was no messages or phone calls from anyone. And so City was totally annoyed and frustrated, but just couldn't deal with this right now. And so she put her phone down and fell asleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, when City woke up, she felt like a brand new person. She was not hungover anymore. She rolled over and grabbed her phone, again expecting to see a message from James or someone. There wasn't anything, and so she called James. But as soon as she called him, she could tell his phone was now off. And so suddenly, City thought to herself, wait a minute, did the prank go badly? Did I do something wrong? Is that why they're ignoring me? And then also City thought to herself, am I still going to get paid for this prank? I told my family I was sending them $100. All day that day, City would sit on her bed in the hotel and call and text James. But James never got back to her. And City did not have the contact info for the other actors or the other producers. And so she was just totally stuck, not really sure what to do. And she just couldn't understand it. I mean, even if it had gone really badly, if she had blown that prank for some reason, she had spent the past 4 weeks with these people, specifically James, flying all over the country with him, going to dinners with him. He had thrown her a birthday party. They had all these long conversations about life. What could she have possibly done that would warrant this kind of treatment? And so by the end of that day, when still City had heard nothing, she just felt totally heartbroken and embarrassed and decided, you know what? I'm done with those people. Tomorrow, I'm going home to my family. And sure enough, the next day, City got up, she grabbed her things, she checked out of the hotel, she headed to the airport to fly back home. But as she was going through security, she heard all this commotion behind her, and she turned and she saw 6 heavily armed police officers sprinting in her direction. And so instinctively, City tried to get out of the way to let them run past her. But instead of the men running past her, they ran right up to her, grabbed her, flipped her around, and put her under arrest. And immediately, City's like, oh my goodness, this is what's been going on. They've been ghosting me for 2 days here because they were setting me up for another prank. I'm part of the prank now. James must be nearby filming, and they've sent these fake police officers to arrest me. And so this is all going to be on the show. And so feeling totally relieved, City began to laugh and said to one of the officers, oh, so this is a prank, huh? And the officer was like, no, this is real. You are under arrest. And when he told her what she was being arrested for, City nearly fainted. Here's what really happened during City's last big prank. After City and Doan had run up on the third actor and Doan rubbed that towel on his face and then City sprayed him with perfume, the 2 women had then disappeared into the crowd, and then the third actor just stood there staring blankly. And then he had kind of stumbled away from the kiosk over to a receptionist where he told her that he was feeling really dizzy. The receptionist could tell this guy definitely needed help. He was unsteady on his feet, his face was all wet, and he was speaking kind of frantically. And so she grabbed a few employees of the the airport, and they clustered around him and began walking him to the medical clinic that was in the airport. And as they escorted him to this clinic, the man began saying he was in so much pain, and he kept walking slower and slower. And then finally, when they actually got him inside this clinic, just a couple of minutes later, he was on the ground having a seizure. Immediately, the medical staff rushed to the man's aid, and they injected him with a medicine to stop the seizure. And then with the help of airport staff, they lifted him up, put him on a stretcher, and then rushed him to an ambulance that was supposed to take him to the hospital. But he would die on the way there. City and Do-won had no idea this had happened to the third actor after the prank. The two women had gone into separate bathrooms and then basically just missed each other. They came out staggered to the meeting point and they didn't see anyone. They both went down to the taxi waiting area thinking that's where everyone had gone. And again, City and Do-won just didn't see each other, and they both got in their own taxis and went back to their own hotels. As for James and the other producers, the reason they were absent after this prank had ended is because they planned to be absent after this prank. As soon as they saw City and Do-won pulling off this prank successfully, they all got up from that restaurant and promptly rushed to board planes that would take them out of the country. Because James and these other producers were not really producers. They didn't have a prank show. It was all a charade. In reality, they worked for the North Korean government, and James, whose real name was Ri Ji-woo, had been tasked by the North Korean government to recruit gullible women, aka City and Do-won, to participate in a top-secret mission that could easily get them killed. In fact, this mission was so sensitive and so dangerous that James and his other TV producers had to live undercover for weeks with Do-won and City kind of slowly convincing them that this was all legitimate and that what they were going to do was just a prank, not a top secret mission. City and Do-won had both been recruited by James because they both were vulnerable and poor. City was also known to be very naive and believed anything she was told, and Do-won was very immature and childlike and overly trusting. All the prank videos that City and Do-won had been independently filming with James and their crew in the weeks leading up to this big final prank had not been episodes of a prank show. They were actually doing pranks on actual unsuspecting people, but it was all rehearsals. James and his crew wanted to make sure that City and Do-won, one, thought this really was a prank show, and two, that they were able to actually do the prank, that they wouldn't chicken out at the end. And on the morning of February 12th, 2017, the day of the big prank, which in reality was the big secret mission, the perfume that City was given was not really perfume, and the oil that was rubbed on Do-won's hands was not really oil. They were the ingredients for a deadly nerve gas called VX. Now, separately, these ingredients would not have harmed either of these two women. But when you combine those ingredients, that's when it turns into a deadly poison. And so that was why City and Do-won had been told to do this prank together, because James and his crew needed them to mix the VX gas on their target's face. And the target was not an actor. His name was Kim Jong-nam, and he had no idea what was going on when City and Do-won touched his face and sprayed him with perfume, but he was dead within 20 minutes, and his death would have been exceptionally painful. It would turn out City and Do-won had been tricked into participating in one of the biggest political assassinations in recent history, because Kim Jong-nam, the target, was actually the exiled brother of the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And it's widely believed that Kim Jong-un is the one who actually authorized this assassination. Both City and Do-won were initially charged with murder in Malaysia, which comes with an automatic death sentence, but those charges were quickly dropped when it was discovered that these two women were clearly victims as well. Surveillance video at the airport shows City and Do-won handling the extremely deadly nerve agent ingredients so casually, and then after they pulled off their prank, which meant they now had VX gas on their hands, they casually were touching their hair and touching their clothes. It's obvious they have no idea what they're doing. The sickness that City started to feel after the prank was not a hangover. Those were symptoms of VX gas poisoning. It just wasn't enough to kill her. Neither James nor any of the other TV producers has ever been arrested, and to this day, North Korea still says they had nothing to do with this assassination. Carlos Camejo woke up freezing cold and totally confused. It was September 6th, 2007, and all Carlos could remember was being on his motorcycle with the hot sun bearing down on him as he wound his way on his bike through the streets of La Victoria, which is a city in Venezuela. Carlos tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't, and then when he tried to move his body, he couldn't do that either. And so he began to panic because he's paralyzed, but he told himself to calm down. If he couldn't move, at least he could think. He could try to process, what's going on here. There has to be an explanation for it. And so Carlos, in total darkness and immobile, began going through over and over again this whole motorcycle trip, which was his last memory. And he remembered that his friend had called him up and asked him to go out on this ride. Carlos used to go out all the time on his bike for fun with his friends and by himself, but now that he was 33 years old and married, he didn't have the time for it as much. But the weather had been so beautiful that when his friend had called and asked to go out, Carlos said, let's do it. And so Carlos began going over in his head the route that they had taken through La Victoria, and all he could remember was this long straightaway and then a right turn and then nothing. It was like after he made that turn, everything went blank. And as Carlos thought about how weird it was that one, he was paralyzed, and two, he had no memory of what happened after he made that right turn, he started to realize that he felt something against his back. It was like there was a block underneath his back, kind of right between his shoulder blades, propping his chest up, and he felt his arms kind of dangling down by the side, and it was very uncomfortable. And as he laid in this totally awkward position, he began to hear somewhere out in the ether unfamiliar voices just kind of chatting. And immediately Carlos is like, okay, someone's here to help me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but somebody's here. I'm going to be okay. And soon, whoever was talking near Carlos had moved closer to him. And actually, Carlos began to realize that it was actually more than one person. It was at least two people talking back and forth. But again, Carlos can't open his eyes. He can't move. He can't communicate with these people. He just knows they've come closer to him. And after these people had moved right up against Carlos suddenly felt something metal pressing up against his chin. And it was kind of sharp and it kind of hurt when it touched his chin. And Carlos wanted to scream out and tell them whatever they were doing to stop and at least tell him what was going on. But Carlos couldn't make a sound. And then Carlos began to hear this kind of mechanical whirring sound, like a machine starting up that was very close to where he was. And suddenly Carlos began panicking, like, what's going on? What are they doing to me? And as Carlos's heart rate is starting to speed up, one of the people who had moved near Carlos suddenly said, oh my God, that's impossible. This can't be. And then again, Carlos felt more pain in his chin. And then the pain got dramatically worse. It went from just kind of like a poking feeling to something going into his chin, and he felt it moving underneath his skin like a knife cutting through him, and then whatever it was, it went out of his chin. And as this is happening, Carlos is trying so hard to just wake himself up and do something to tell these people to stop, but he just couldn't do it. And then again, he felt that sharp pain in his chin, another round of something going into him, moving underneath his skin and then poking out again, and the pain became so blinding that suddenly Carlos was able to kind of break through this paralysis and his eyes shot open. And for a second, all Carlos could see was like blinding lights. But then as things came into focus, he saw there were two people, the people who had been speaking, wearing these huge goggles and face masks, and one of them was holding a big needle with black thread attached to it, and that thread was coming from Carlos's chin. They had been running that needle through his face, stitching his chin for some reason, but with no anesthetic. And so as Carlos is staring up at these people in goggles, the people in goggles are looking down at Carlos and they're totally horrified, and they just kind of begin backing up, not really sure what to make of this. And then Carlos, again, kind of breaking through this weird paralysis he was under, he was able to lift his head up and look down at his body. And he saw, to his horror, that he was totally nude. He was laying on a metal table, and there was this Y drawn on his chest, starting at his collarbones, coming down right underneath his throat, and then straight down across his chest. And then after Carlos saw this Y on his naked body, he looked over at a tray that was right next to this metal table near these two guys in goggles who were now kind of backing up, and he saw there was a whirring instrument on this table, and it was a circular blade, a saw. That was the sound he heard, and that's when Carlos figured it out. Earlier that day, when Carlos had been out riding his motorcycle with his friend, he had gone down that long straightaway in La Victoria, he had made a right turn, and parked illegally right after this turn was this big truck. Carlos didn't see it, and at full speed, he impacted the truck, he was thrown from his bike, smashed into the ground, horrific injuries, and when paramedics showed up, they pronounced him dead on the scene. And so he was moved from the scene of the accident to the morgue. And at the morgue, Carlos was stripped naked and put on this metal table, and they placed a block underneath his shoulders, kind of propping his chest up, and they drew a Y down the center of his chest for his autopsy. The two doctors that Carlos ultimately saw chatting and performing this autopsy were going to follow that Y on his body with the circular saw. That's how they cut you open during an autopsy. But right before they were about to do that, the doctors noticed that Carlos was actively bleeding from his chin. And since he was supposed to be dead, that didn't make any sense. And so that was why one of the doctors had said, "Oh my goodness, this can't be." And so not really sure what to make of it, they had just grabbed a needle and begun stitching his face together to stop the blood from going down his chest. And then Carlos opened his eyes, and it dawned on the two doctors that, oh, he's alive. That's why he's still bleeding. We should definitely take care of him now. But amazingly, after Carlos came back from the dead, he was simply moved into the hallway and left on this metal table, and the doctors who were going to perform his autopsy just left the paper that said he needed an autopsy in his pocket, just kind of showing that, hey, we were just following orders, somebody told us to give you an autopsy, this is not our fault. And that's where Carlos stayed until his wife showed up and found him in the hallway just laying there as if he was still just waiting for his autopsy. Carlos would suffer horrible injuries from the accident and serious emotional trauma from almost being cut open during this autopsy, but he would make a full recovery. On the afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day, the weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around to the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear, the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my God, it's gonna charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately Natalia dropped the drill and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear right behind it and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second. It turns around, and you got to remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood. And it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified. She begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear. And so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot, and they found Valia, who was totally in shock, and she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened, and a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them, and they all raised their rifles, and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive. Brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident and one of her car windows had broken and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's got to be something minor. I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Geronte, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was, and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Geronte said, of course. He went in the kitchen, he got what she needed, he brought it back. She said thank you, she took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Geronte heard a knock at the front door, and Geronte, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Geronte turned to Nicole and said, hey, it's Leisha, do you want me to get the door? And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, no, please just ignore her. Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery, but Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more, and she knew that Leisha and Geronte didn't really get along too well, and so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Geronte and just said, I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down. And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there, and when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact, and Nicole's like, oh my God, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds, but now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, Nicole, I know you're there. Come on, let me in. I want to help you. But Nicole, she just could not deal with it. And so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors, and they had become friends really quickly. They had been pregnant at the same time, and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Geronte had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart because Leisha and Geronte both had very strong personalities and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Geronte had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Geronte. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, come on, I know you're in there, Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Geronte. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Geronte started to sour. Geronte didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day when she hears the back door open, and it's Geronte, and he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, "You know what? We're done." And immediately Geronte got so mad, and he's like, "How dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that." And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, thank goodness. A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house, knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Geronte, and so feel free to come over, there's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seeing her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark, all the windows are covered up, and Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, "Oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache?" And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, "Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad." And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Geronte, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, "What did you eat today?" were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, "Hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital." And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated, they asked what medication she was taking, they asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, you know what, fine, I'm breaking up with you. And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her, gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just gonna leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, what? Like, I want you to leave. Like, get out of here. And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. And Nicole believed it. It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan, and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also, because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like, we can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet, and so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years. And then finally, when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic and there was this whole long standoff, but then finally he would surrender himself, and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of. And so ultimately he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like these that are available right now. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.